I never imagined I'd come home one morning to find my bank account emptied, every cent vanished, while I had just been on my usual walk around the Queens neighborhood I'd called home for 37 years. That day, my heart shattered louder than the cold New York wind whipping through the empty streets, carrying with it the scent of betrayal that would forever change how I saw my own flesh and blood. The silence when I checked my phone that morning was deafening, because for the first time in decades, I realized I was truly alone. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. Every morning at 6:15 sharp, I step out into the city's gray skyline, past the bodega on Northern Boulevard where Mr. Martinez still waves from behind bulletproof glass, past the small playground where I once pushed my grandchildren on swings that now squeak empty in the wind. The morning air carries the distant hum of taxis, the scent of pretzel vendors curling through the air like a nostalgic painting of better times. I was used to the exhausting cycle, rising early while my bones protested, tidying my small two-bedroom apartment that felt too big and too quiet, making coffee in a pot meant for four but drinking it alone, waiting for a call that rarely came, checking my phone for messages that never appeared. That morning was no different, or so I thought. I left my phone on the kitchen counter beside the ceramic mug my daughter-in-law gave me 3 Christmases ago, believing in those small moments of peace that my morning walks provided. The air was crisp and clean in a way that only October in New York can be, and I breathed it in like medicine for a soul that had been slowly suffocating. I remembered walking these same streets when my son David was 7, his small hand in mine, pointing at the changing leaves and asking why they had to fall. "So new ones can grow," I had told him then. If only I had known how prophetic those words would become. I remembered the days when David would run to greet me at the doorstep of this very apartment, his smile bright as summer sunshine, his wife Jennifer by his side, carrying laughter and warmth into rooms that had felt cold for too long. Their presence had felt like a sanctuary, a promise that family meant something more than blood and obligation. Their children, my precious grandchildren Emma and Michael, would fill this place with drawings stuck to the refrigerator, with the sound of cartoons echoing from the living room, with the beautiful chaos that makes a house feel alive. Now, that door was silent, painted white like the walls of a hospital room, cold and sterile and empty of everything that had once made me believe in the meaning of family. When I returned from my walk that October morning, I found an eviction notice slipped under my apartment door, the county seal pressed into the paper like a death certificate. My hands shook as I read the words, "Failure to pay rent for 3 consecutive months." 3 months. I had never missed a rent payment in my life. Never. Not even during the recession when I worked 2 jobs, cleaning office buildings at night and watching other people's children during the day, just to keep this roof over our heads. My legs felt like water as I stumbled to my kitchen table, the same table where David had done his homework, where Jennifer had planned their wedding, where we had shared countless meals that now tasted like dust in my memory. But the eviction notice was nothing compared to what I discovered next. With trembling fingers, I opened my phone and checked my savings account, the account I had protected like a mother protects her child, the account that held every penny I had scraped together from 40 years of work, from selling my mother's jewelry when she passed, from every birthday check I had never spent on myself. The screen showed a balance of $7.33. $7.33 of a life that had once held over $47,000. My entire life savings, gone. Vanished. Stolen while I had been walking the streets, believing in the simple pleasure of autumn air and changing leaves. The betrayal was not just financial, it was a blow that left me gasping for breath in my own kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of better times. Someone had cleaned out my account while I was gone for exactly 43 minutes. Someone who knew my banking information, someone who had access to my personal details, someone I trusted. The cruel realization hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest, it could only have been family. Only David and Jennifer had my banking information. Only they knew about the emergency fund I kept for medical expenses, for the grandchildren's college education, for the future I had been so carefully planning. I sat in my kitchen chair, the same chair I had rocked David in when he was colicky, and I felt something inside me break. Not just crack, but shatter completely, like my grandmother's china teacup had when I dropped it during the blizzard of '93. The sound echoed in the empty apartment, and for the first time in my 72 years, I understood what it meant to be truly abandoned. For decades, I gave everything to my family, money, time, endless forgiveness, pieces of my soul that I never asked to get back. I remember lending David $8,000 when his construction business stumbled 3 years ago. He had sat right here at this kitchen table, his head in his hands, his voice cracking as he whispered, "Mom, you're my rock. Without you, I'd lose everything." I had written that check without hesitation, taking the money from my retirement fund, believing that this was what love looked like. When he promised to pay me back within 6 months, I believed him. When 6 months became a year, I made excuses for him. When a year became 3 years, I stopped asking. Jennifer had different strategies. She would call late at night when she knew I'd be tired, when my defenses were down, her voice sweet as honey but sharp as broken glass. "Mom," she'd say, though I was never really her mother, just a convenient source of funding, "we're really struggling this month. Could you help with the grocery bill? It's just for now." Just for now became just this once became just until things get better. First it was groceries, then utilities, then car payments, then the down payment for Emma's dance lessons, then Michael's baseball camp, then a vacation to Florida that they desperately needed, while I ate canned soup for dinner and wore the same winter coat I'd owned for 15 years. But healing wounds wasn't their priority, it was entitlement. They needed new furniture while I sat on a couch with springs that poked through the fabric. They bought organic groceries while I clipped coupons and shopped clearance racks. Jennifer got her nails done professionally while I cut my own hair in the bathroom mirror, watching my reflection grow older and more tired with each passing month. The cold silence when I hesitated before reaching for my checkbook became deafening, a weapon they wielded with the precision of experienced manipulators. One night last spring, over a barely eaten dinner of leftover meatloaf in our cramped kitchen, I asked softly, "Will this ever end? Will there ever be a time when you don't need my help?" The question hung in the air like smoke, filling the space between us with uncomfortable truth. David's eyes darted away from mine, his jaw clenched tight as a closed fist. "Everything I do is for you, Mom," he said, but the edge in his voice cut deeper than any knife. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The economy is tough. Prices are going up. The kids need things. Jennifer's been stressed. Always excuses. Always reasons why my money was their right, why my sacrifice was their inheritance." I began to wonder if love was merely a transaction for them, if I had become nothing more than a bank account with a heartbeat. The thought crept into my mind during sleepless nights, whispering doubts that I tried to push away but couldn't silence. Was I a mother, or was I an ATM? Was I family, or was I just convenient? The questions followed me through my days like shadows, growing longer as the sun of my life started to set. Have you ever felt used by the people you love most? Have you ever given until it hurt, then given more because you were afraid that stopping would mean losing them completely? The microaggressions started small, like paper cuts that seem insignificant until you realize you're bleeding from 1,000 tiny wounds. Birthdays passed with empty chairs at my dining room table and forgotten calls that never came. My 71st birthday fell on a Tuesday in March. I had set the table for 5, made David's favorite pot roast, baked a cake from scratch using my mother's recipe. I waited until 9 o'clock that night for someone to remember, someone to call, someone to show up. The pot roast grew cold. The cake sat untouched. The silence stretched through my apartment like a living thing, growing heavy and thick until it pressed against my chest and made it hard to breathe. When I got sick last winter, a dangerous bout of pneumonia that landed me in Queens General for 4 days, they showed no concern, brushing off my fevers and difficulty breathing as minor annoyances, inconvenient interruptions in their busy lives. "It's just a cold, Mom," Jennifer had said when I called from my hospital bed, my voice weak and raspy. "You'll be fine. You're tough." She didn't visit. David came once, stayed for 15 minutes, spent most of that time checking his phone and complaining about hospital parking fees. The smell of antiseptic and industrial-strength floor wax still lingered in my memory as I lay alone in that narrow bed, connected to machines that beeped and hummed through the long nights, waiting for someone who cared enough to sit with me, to hold my hand, to ask the doctors questions I was too weak to ask myself. The elderly woman in the bed next to mine received visitors every day, children, grandchildren, friends who brought flowers and magazines and homemade cookies. Her bedside table overflowed with cards and family photos. Mine held a plastic water cup and a box of tissues the nurse had left behind. But hearts have their breaking points, and mine was rapidly approaching its limit. The loneliness wasn't just an emotion anymore, it was a physical presence in my life, a cold companion that slept in the empty half of my bed and sat across from me at the breakfast table. I started talking to my reflection in the bathroom mirror, having conversations with the woman staring back at me with tired eyes and silver hair that had once been auburn and full of life. "What are you doing?" I would whisper to her. "Why are you letting them treat you this way?" But even as I asked the questions, I knew the answers. Fear. Fear of being completely alone. Fear that saying no would mean losing the little contact I still had with my grandchildren. Fear that standing up for myself would prove what I suspected they already believed, that I was disposable, replaceable, just another burden in their complicated lives. Then, 3 months before that devastating morning walk, I stumbled onto something that changed everything. I was helping Jennifer organize some paperwork for their tax preparation, another favor I provided for free while they paid a professional accountant $200 an hour, when I found bank statements left carelessly in a pile of mail on their kitchen counter. My name caught my eye first, printed in black ink across the top of several withdrawal slips. My account number. My routing number. My signature, or what looked like my signature, authorizing transfers I had never approved. Multiple withdrawals from my account. Charges I never authorized. Money moving from my savings to their checking account like water flowing downhill, steady and constant and completely without my knowledge or consent. $500 here, $800 there, $1,200 for what purpose I couldn't determine. The amounts were always just small enough to avoid triggering any automatic notifications from my bank, just large enough to drain my life savings drop by drop, dollar by dollar, day by day. I held those crisp pieces of paper until they crumpled in my shaking hands, evidence of a betrayal so complete and calculated that it took my breath away. These weren't desperate emergency withdrawals. This wasn't a one-time desperate act by children in crisis. This was systematic theft, planned and executed over months, possibly years. They had been stealing from me while I worried about having enough money to buy them Christmas presents. They had been emptying my account while I ate beans and rice for dinner to save money, telling myself that my sacrifices were worth it if my family was comfortable and happy. Tears silently traced lines down my aging cheeks, each one carrying years of disappointment and betrayal. I sat in their modern kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances I had helped them buy, and I felt like a fool. A stupid, trusting, generous fool who had confused love with enabling, who had mistaken manipulation for need, who had allowed herself to become a victim of the people she would have died to protect. The porcelain mug in my hand, the same mug Jennifer had given me for Christmas, slipped from my fingers and shattered on their tile floor. The sound echoed through their house like my breaking spirit, sharp and final and impossible to take back. For the first time in my life, I thought with perfect clarity, no more. But even as the words formed in my mind, the thought of being alone, truly and completely alone, terrified me. Could I choose dignity over family? Could I survive without them, even if being with them was killing me slowly, one betrayal at a time? The battle inside me was like the swirling autumn leaves outside their window, chaotic and relentless and impossible to control. I cleaned up the broken ceramic pieces carefully, methodically, the way I had cleaned up their messes for years. But something had shifted inside me during those moments on their kitchen floor. Something had hardened and crystallized and declared that enough was enough. When I got home that night, I packed their childhood photos away, storing them in a cardboard box I tucked into the back of my bedroom closet. Pictures of David learning to ride a bicycle, his gap-toothed grin wide with pride and accomplishment. Pictures of his wedding day, Jennifer beautiful in her grandmother's dress, both of them young and hopeful and full of promises they had no intention of keeping. Pictures of Emma and Michael as babies, as toddlers, as growing children who had been taught to see me as a source of funding rather than a grandmother who loved them unconditionally. I stood in front of my full-length mirror, staring at my reflection and searching for the brave woman I thought I had lost somewhere between the first loan I never got back and the last time they had looked at me with genuine affection rather than calculating need. The woman looking back at me was tired, worn down by years of giving more than she had to give, but there was something else in her eyes now. Something that looked like determination. Something that whispered the possibility of change. Do you recognize that moment when you realize you've been living someone else's definition of love instead of your own? When you understand that you've been so afraid of losing people that you've lost yourself instead? When I finally confronted David about the unauthorized withdrawals, his face transformed in ways that revealed the stranger my own son had become. His expression twisted between anger and hurt, but mostly anger, the righteous indignation of someone who had been caught doing something inexcusable and didn't like being held accountable for his choices. "Mom, you don't understand the pressures we have," he insisted, his voice rising to that pitch he had used as a child when he was lying about broken vases or missing homework. "Jennifer lost her job last month. The mortgage payment is behind. Emma needs braces. Michael's school is expensive. We didn't want to worry you." He painted himself as the victim in a masterpiece of manipulation, standing in my living room surrounded by furniture I had helped him buy, wearing clothes I had helped him afford, living in a house whose down payment had come from my retirement savings. Jennifer appeared behind him like a shadow, her face a mask of practiced innocence and carefully crafted hurt. "We're your family," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of wounded righteousness that makes victims feel guilty for being victimized. "How can you accuse us like this? After everything we've done for you? After all the times we've included you in our lives, invited you to dinner, brought the kids to see you." My daughter Sarah, David's younger sister, kept silent during this confrontation, her eyes avoiding mine with the skill of someone who had perfected the art of not getting involved. She lived in California now, had her own family, her own problems, her own reasons for staying distant from the chaos that had become our family dynamics. The grandchildren looked confused and uncomfortable, caught in the middle of a storm they didn't understand, their young faces reflecting the tension and anger that filled my small living room like poisonous gas. I felt crushed but hesitant to sever the ties that had defined my identity for so many years. After all, blood runs deep in the city where family often means survival, where community bonds are forged in necessity and maintained through obligation as much as love. Queens is a place where 3 generations live under one roof by choice, where children grow up expecting to care for aging parents, where family loyalty isn't just a value but a practical survival strategy. What would it mean to break those bonds? What would it mean to choose myself over the people who shared my DNA, my history, my most precious memories? But then there was Mrs. Hernandez, my next-door neighbor for the past 8 years. Maria Elena Hernandez was a soft-spoken widow whose husband had died in the construction accident that also took 3 other men from our neighborhood. She often checked in on me, bringing homemade soup when I was sick, stopping by on Sundays just to chat and share coffee, offering company that came without conditions or hidden agendas or requests for financial assistance. Her kindness felt like a fragile lifeline in an ocean of manipulation and disappointment, and I was slowly learning to grasp it without feeling guilty, without waiting for the inevitable request for money or favors that never came. Maria understood loss in ways my own children never had. She had buried the love of her life, raised 4 children as a single mother, worked as a seamstress in Manhattan's garment district for 37 years, and somehow maintained a spirit of generosity and hope that shamed me with its simple authenticity. When I told her about the missing money, her reaction was immediate and clear: Mija, family or not, stealing is stealing. Love doesn't take without permission. Love asks, and love accepts when the answer is no. Her words stayed with me through sleepless nights and worry-filled days. Love accepts when the answer is no. When had I ever said no to David or Jennifer? When had I ever established a boundary, drawn a line, insisted on respect as the price of my generosity? Never. Not once in all the years of giving and giving and giving until I had nothing left to give except my dignity, and now they were asking for that too. I remember the trembling in my fingers that day in November when I told my son no for the first time in his 38 years of life. No to borrowing more money, no to their demands, no to the emergency loan they needed for reasons that kept changing every time I asked for clarification. It was like stepping off a cliff without knowing whether I would fall or fly, but when I landed, I discovered solid ground beneath my feet for the first time in years. No, I said, standing in my own living room, looking at my own son, speaking with my own voice that I was just beginning to recognize again. No, I will not give you any more money. No, I will not co-sign another loan. No, I will not be your safety net while you make financial decisions that don't include planning for your own emergencies. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I had never learned properly, but it also felt powerful in ways I hadn't expected. David's face went through several transformations: surprise, disbelief, anger, manipulation, and finally a kind of calculation that chilled me to my bones. "Mom, you don't mean that," he said in the tone people use when they're talking to children or very elderly people who have lost their mental faculties. "You're upset. You're not thinking clearly. We can work this out. Jennifer and I have been talking, and we think maybe you should consider moving in with us. You're getting older, and this apartment is expensive, and we worry about you living alone." The suggestion hit me like ice water in the face. Move in with them? Give up my independence, my privacy, my autonomy? Become a live-in babysitter and ATM, available 24 hours a day for their convenience? No, I said again, and this time the word came easier, stronger, with the weight of absolute certainty behind it. I will not be moving in with you. I will not be giving you any more money. And I will not be discussing this again. I met with a lawyer that week, recommended by Maria Hernandez, who knew someone whose son worked in elder law, and I learned about financial abuse, about protecting elderly people from predatory family members, about the legal options available to recover stolen funds and prevent future theft. Attorney Margaret Rodriguez was a woman about my daughter's age, professional and kind but absolutely clear about the reality of my situation. "Mrs. Morrison, what your son and daughter-in-law have done constitutes financial elder abuse," she explained in her office overlooking Northern Boulevard. "You have legal recourse. We can pursue criminal charges, file civil suits to recover the money, and we can certainly put safeguards in place to prevent future unauthorized access to your accounts." She helped me freeze my accounts, change all my banking passwords, revoke any power of attorney documents I had signed in more trusting times, and establish new security protocols that would make it impossible for anyone to access my money without my explicit written consent. That night, for the first time in years, maybe decades, I slept through the dark New York night undisturbed by worry, anxiety, or the persistent fear that I wasn't doing enough, giving enough, sacrificing enough to earn the love of my own children. The silence in my apartment wasn't empty anymore, it was freedom. Freedom from the constant pressure of other people's crises. Freedom from the guilt of never having enough to give. Freedom from the exhausting effort of trying to buy affection from people who saw me as nothing more than a renewable resource. I bought a small journal from the corner store and began to write, documenting my story, recording the details of months and years of manipulation and theft, but also capturing the growing sense of strength and autonomy that came with each day of independence. Writing felt like learning to walk all over again, like discovering muscles I had forgotten I possessed, like finding my voice after decades of silence and accommodation and self-sacrifice that had nearly erased me completely. Have you ever discovered that saying no to the wrong people creates space for the right people to enter your life? Have you ever found that the thing you were most afraid of, being alone, was actually the thing you needed most? 6 months after I froze my bank accounts and hired an attorney, our family gathered for what would become our final confrontation in the same cramped apartment where I had endured years of exploitation and emotional manipulation. The air was heavy with unspoken accusations and decades of resentment that had been fermenting in the silence between us. David sat on my couch with his arms crossed, Jennifer beside him with her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, both of them radiating the kind of anger that comes from having a reliable source of income suddenly cut off without warning or negotiation. I had prepared for this moment for months, but I still felt my heart racing as I walked to the mantelpiece where our family photos had lived for so many years. I picked up their wedding picture, the one where they looked young and hopeful and full of promises they had never intended to keep, and I held it in my hands like evidence in a trial where I was both the prosecutor and the witness for the defense. "This picture represents a dream I had about what family could be," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "A dream where love was mutual, where respect was automatic, where trust was honored instead of exploited." I paused, looking at their faces, searching for some sign of remorse or understanding or acknowledgement of the pain they had caused. I found none. Jennifer was checking her phone. David was shaking his head like I was delivering a speech he had heard too many times before. I ripped the photograph in half, the sound like a small thunderclap in the silent room. Emma gasped. Michael looked confused. Jennifer finally looked up from her phone with an expression of shock and outrage. "Mom, what are you doing?" David demanded, standing up from the couch as if he were going to physically stop me from destroying property that belonged to me, memories that had cost me everything and given me nothing in return. "I'm choosing dignity over delusion," I replied, taking the torn pieces of the photograph and locking them in a small wooden jewelry box my mother had left me, a box that had once held precious things and now held the remnants of precious illusions. The lock clicked with a finality that seemed to echo through the apartment and through my heart. "This box represents the past, and I'm locking the past away where it belongs. Away from my present. Away from my future." David's voice wavered for the first time in months, and I heard an echo of the little boy who used to run to me for comfort when thunderstorms scared him, when bullies at school made him cry, when the world seemed too big and frightening for his small shoulders to carry. "Mom, please don't do this. We need you. I know we've made mistakes, but we're family. Family forgives. Family helps each other. You always taught me that." I looked him in the eye, this man who had once been my precious baby, my toddler, my child, my hope for the future. "You're right," I said steadily. "Family does forgive. Family does help each other. But that means all members of the family, not just one member giving until she has nothing left while the others take until there's nothing left to take." I paused, drawing strength from the months of therapy and reflection and painful growth that had brought me to this moment. "I will no longer buy love. I will no longer finance my own exploitation. Respect me or lose me." The quiet shock that rippled through the room was almost visible, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. For the first time in their adult lives, someone had set boundaries with consequences, someone had refused to be manipulated by guilt and obligation, someone had chosen self-preservation over self-destruction. Jennifer found her voice first, her tone sharp with indignation and barely controlled rage. "After everything we've done for you? After all the times we included you in our lives? This is how you repay us? By cutting us off, by refusing to help your own grandchildren, by choosing money over family?" Her words were designed to wound, to rain still the guilt and shame that had controlled me for so many years, but they bounced off me like raindrops on a well-waxed car. "What have you done for me?" I asked quietly. "Please, tell me what you've done for me that didn't involve spending my money, using my resources, or taking my time without offering anything in return. Tell me about one conversation we've had in the last 5 years that didn't end with a request for financial assistance. Tell me about one visit that wasn't motivated by need rather than genuine affection." The silence that followed my questions was deafening because we all knew the answers. There had been no visits just to visit. No calls just to chat. No invitations that didn't come with expectations. No relationship that wasn't transactional at its core. But life has a way of delivering final tests when you think you've already passed the hardest examinations, and mine came 3 weeks after that confrontation, when I thought I had finally achieved some measure of peace and resolution. I was checking my email on a quiet Sunday morning when I discovered a GoFundMe page that Jennifer had created, complete with my photograph and a story that painted me as a cruel, vindictive old woman who had abandoned her struggling family in their time of greatest need. The page was titled, "Help a Young Family Recover from Elder Abuse," and the description was a masterpiece of manipulation and outright lies. According to Jennifer's version of our story, I was a bitter, mentally unstable woman who had turned against her own children for no reason anyone could understand. She claimed that I had stolen money from them, money they had given me to invest on their behalf, and that I was now holding their financial future hostage because of some imagined slight or psychological breakdown related to my advancing age. The post had been shared dozens of times on social media, generating hundreds of dollars in donations from friends, neighbors, and strangers who believed they were helping victims of elder financial abuse recover from the actions of a deranged grandmother. Comments from people I knew, people from our neighborhood, people from David's work and Jennifer's social circles, expressed outrage on their behalf and sympathy for their terrible situation. The lies stung like a swarm of wasps, each false claim piercing my sense of justice and fairness. But as I sat in my kitchen reading the comments and studying the carefully crafted narrative that painted me as the villain in my own story of victimization, I realized something profound had happened to me over these months of independence and self-advocacy. I was not destroyed by their lies. I was not tempted to respond with my own version of the truth. I was not driven to defend myself against accusations that were so far from reality that only people who had never known me could believe them. Instead, I smiled quietly at my reflection in my laptop screen, feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades, complete and unshakable certainty about who I was and what I deserved. This silent calm was my victory, proof that their opinion of me no longer had the power to define my opinion of myself. I had found something more valuable than their approval or their presence in my life. I had found my own respect for the person I had become through surviving their treatment of the person I had been. I closed the laptop without responding to the false accusations, without trying to correct the online record, without engaging in a battle for public opinion that I had already won in the only arena that truly mattered, my own heart and mind. Let them tell whatever stories they needed to tell to sleep at night. I knew the truth, and the truth had set me free in ways they would never understand because they had never been imprisoned by their own kindness, their own generosity, their own desperate need to be loved by people who were incapable of loving anyone but themselves. The transformation that followed my decision to stop engaging with their drama was gradual but profound, like watching a garden recover from a long drought when it finally receives the water it needs to bloom again. I finally booked a trip to the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York, somewhere I had always dreamed of visiting but never dared because there was always someone else who needed the money I might have spent on my own dreams and desires. The train ride north from Penn Station took me through landscapes I had only seen in photographs, rolling hills covered in forests that seemed to stretch forever, small towns with white church steeples and main streets that looked like postcards from a simpler time, lakes that reflected the sky like mirrors polished by wind and time. The fresh mountain air filled my lungs as I stepped off the train in Lake Placid, each breath peeling away years of city pollution and family toxicity and self-imposed martyrdom. I stayed in a small bed and breakfast run by a couple in their 60s who had retired early from careers in Manhattan and decided to spend their remaining years helping other people find peace and restoration in the mountains they had learned to love. My room overlooked a lake so clear I could see fish swimming in its depths, so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat for the first time in years without the constant background noise of other people's crises and demands. I hiked every day, sometimes for hours at a time, following trails that led through forests where the only sounds were birdsong and wind through leaves and my own footsteps on paths worn smooth by generations of people seeking solitude and natural beauty. Each step felt like walking away from the person I had been, tired, depleted, taken for granted, and toward the person I was becoming, strong, autonomous, worthy of respect and kindness. On my third day in the mountains, I reached a summit that offered a view of the entire lake region spread out below like a painting created by someone who understood that beauty doesn't require human approval or validation to exist. I sat on a boulder warmed by autumn sunshine and I cried, not from sadness or loss or regret, but from relief so profound it felt like being born again at 72 years old. When I returned to Queens a week later, I felt different in ways that were immediately apparent to anyone who looked closely. I walked straighter. I spoke more clearly. I made eye contact without flinching or apologizing for taking up space in the world. I had remembered what it felt like to exist for my own benefit rather than for the convenience of people who had never appreciated the gift of my presence in their lives. I joined a painting class at the Queens Community Center, something I had wanted to do since my retirement but had never pursued because David and Jennifer always had emergencies that required my attention and my money. The instructor was a woman in her 80s named Rose who had been painting for 60 years and still approached each canvas with the excitement of someone discovering art for the first time. Art is about seeing what's really there instead of what you think should be there, she told our class during my first session. I was attempting to paint a bowl of fruit, apples and oranges and grapes arranged on a simple white cloth. But I kept trying to make the apples redder than they actually were, the oranges more perfectly round than nature had created them. Look again, Rose said gently, standing beside my easel. Don't paint what you think an apple should look like. Paint the apple that's actually in front of you, with its imperfections and its unique character and its individual beauty. The lesson felt like a metaphor for everything I was learning about life and family and love. Stop trying to create the relationships you think you should have and start appreciating the relationships that are actually possible with real people in the real world. The painting helped me see color and light and hope again in ways I had forgotten were possible. When I mixed yellow and blue to create green, when I blended red and white to find the perfect shade of pink for apple blossoms I painted from memory, when I discovered that purple could be warm or cool depending on whether I added more red or more blue, I was also discovering that my life could have hues and tones and dimensions I had never explored while I was focused entirely on other people's needs and desires. With Maria Hernandez's friendship blossoming into something genuine and unconditional, the first authentic relationship I had experienced in years, I began to understand what affection looked like when it wasn't tied to obligation, guilt, fear, or financial transaction. Maria and I met for coffee every Tuesday morning at a Dominican bakery on Roosevelt Avenue, where we would share pastries and conversation that ranged from neighborhood gossip to philosophy to memories of our younger selves to hopes for whatever time we had remaining. Maria never asked me for money. She never needed favors that required me to sacrifice my own comfort or convenience. She never made me feel guilty for saying no to requests, because she never made requests that put me in the position of having to choose between her needs and my own boundaries. Instead, she brought me soup when I had a cold, called to check on me during snowstorms, invited me to accompany her to her grandson's baseball games, and shared the kind of easy companionship that made me remember why human connection could be a source of joy rather than stress. Friendship shouldn't be exhausting, she told me one morning as we watched pigeons fight over crumbs near the bus stop outside the bakery. If you're tired after spending time with someone, that person is taking more energy than they're giving. Her words were simple but profound, a measuring stick I could use to evaluate all the relationships in my life, past, present, and future. My apartment, which had once felt cluttered with memories that caused pain rather than comfort, slowly transformed into a sanctuary that reflected my emerging sense of self rather than my history of self-sacrifice. I packed away photographs that made me feel sad or guilty or angry, replacing them with pictures from my mountain trip, paintings I created in art class, cards from Maria, and a mirror positioned to catch the morning light streaming through my kitchen window. The mirror was perhaps the most important addition to my new life. Every morning, I looked at my reflection and I spoke words of encouragement and affirmation to the woman looking back at me. You are worthy of respect, I would say. You deserve kindness. You have the right to say no. Your needs matter as much as anyone else's needs. The practice felt silly at first, but gradually it became as natural and necessary as brushing my teeth or making coffee, essential maintenance for a sense of self-worth that had been neglected for decades. I stopped wearing the drab, practical clothes I had chosen during my years of self-imposed poverty and self-denial. One Saturday morning, I went shopping for myself for the first time in years, choosing colors that made me feel alive rather than invisible. I bought a bright red scarf, the color of courage, as Maria called it, and I wore it on my morning walks, feeling like a flag of independence flowing behind me as I moved through the neighborhood with new purpose and pride. The red scarf became a symbol of my transformation, a visible reminder that I had chosen vitality over invisibility, self-respect over self-sacrifice, authentic relationships over manipulative ones. When I caught glimpses of myself in store windows or reflective surfaces, I saw a woman who looked familiar but different, older, yes, but also somehow younger, as if reclaiming my autonomy had reversed some of the aging that comes from stress and exploitation and chronic disappointment. Months later, as spring arrived in Queens with its promise of new growth and fresh beginnings, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me from victimhood to empowerment, from exploitation to independence, from despair to something that felt remarkably like contentment. The sunsets outside my window reminded me that endings carry the promise of new beginnings, that sometimes what looks like loss is actually liberation in disguise. I had lost the illusion of family loyalty, but I had gained authentic friendship. I had lost access to grandchildren who had been taught to see me as an ATM rather than a grandmother, but I had gained countless hours to pursue interests and relationships that fed my soul instead of draining it. I had lost the fantasy of unconditional love from people who were incapable of loving anyone unconditionally, but I had found something more valuable, unconditional respect for myself. The woman I saw in my mirror now was someone I recognized from decades ago, before marriage to a man who died too young, before single motherhood consumed my identity, before grandmotherhood became synonymous with financial obligation, before I forgot that my worth was not determined by my usefulness to other people. She was a woman who had worked hard and loved deeply and deserved better than she had been receiving from the people who should have treasured her most. One evening in late April, as I sat in my favorite chair reading a novel I had chosen purely for my own enjoyment, a luxury I had rarely allowed myself during the years when every spare moment was occupied by solving other people's problems, I heard a knock at my door. My first thought was that it might be David or Jennifer, finally ready to apologize, to acknowledge the harm they had caused, to work toward some kind of authentic reconciliation based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. But when I opened the door, I found Emma, my 15-year-old granddaughter, standing in the hallway with tears in her eyes and a backpack slung over her shoulder. "Grandma," she said softly, "can I talk to you? I think I understand now what really happened between you and my parents. And I wanted to say I'm sorry." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and covered territory that was sometimes painful, sometimes healing, always honest in ways that family conversations rarely achieve. Emma had reached an age where she could see through her parents' manipulations and recognize the difference between genuine love and transactional relationships. She had started paying attention to how they talked about me when they thought she wasn't listening, how they planned their financial strategies around my predictable generosity, how they had trained her and her brother to see me as a source of funding rather than a human being deserving of respect and affection. "I remember when you used to take me to the park every Saturday," she told me, curled up on my couch with a cup of hot chocolate I had made from scratch, the way I used to make it for David when he was her age. "You never asked me to do anything for you. You never made me feel like I owed you something for spending time with me. You just wanted to be with me because you loved me." I didn't understand how rare that was until I got older and started paying attention to how other people interact with each other. We talked about boundaries and respect, about the difference between helping people and enabling them, about how real love sometimes requires saying no to requests that would harm the person making them as much as the person being asked to fulfill them. Emma was intelligent enough to understand that my decision to stop supporting her parents financially was actually an act of love, an attempt to force them to develop independence and responsibility and problem-solving skills they would never acquire as long as they could rely on my resources to solve their problems. "Are you happier now?" she asked as she prepared to leave that evening, her question carrying genuine curiosity rather than judgment or manipulation. I considered her question carefully, looking around my peaceful apartment, thinking about my painting class and my friendship with Maria and my mountain adventure and my morning walks that now felt like celebrations rather than escapes. "Yes," I said simply. "I am happier now. I'm also lonelier sometimes, but it's a clean loneliness, if that makes sense. It's the loneliness of being by myself, not the loneliness of being with people who don't really see me or value me for who I am." Emma nodded with the wisdom of someone who had learned early that being alone is different from being lonely, that some relationships create more isolation than solitude ever could. "I want to visit you sometimes," she said. "Not because my parents told me to, not because I need money or help with something, just because I want to spend time with you. Would that be okay?" The question brought tears to my eyes because it represented everything I had hoped for but never dared to expect, a relationship based on choice rather than obligation, on affection rather than transaction, on genuine connection rather than manufactured family loyalty. "That would be more than okay," I told her. "That would be wonderful." As I write this final chapter of my story, Emma has visited me 6 times over the past 3 months. We paint together sometimes, cook together sometimes, walk through the neighborhood sharing observations about life and dreams and the complicated business of figuring out how to be authentic in a world that often rewards pretense and manipulation. Her presence in my life feels like a gift I didn't know I deserved, proof that some relationships can survive the destruction of others, that love expressed honestly creates space for more love to grow. David and Jennifer have continued their pattern of crisis and drama, but their emergencies no longer become my emergencies, their poor planning no longer requires my resources to solve. I hear about their struggles through Emma, who visits them regularly but no longer allows herself to be manipulated into carrying messages or requests for financial assistance. They have been forced to develop the skills that adults need to manage their own lives, and while the process has been difficult for them, it has also been liberating for me. I don't know if we will ever reconcile in any meaningful way. I hope we will, but I no longer organize my life around that hope or sacrifice my well-being to make reconciliation more likely. I have learned that the people who truly love you will find ways to respect your boundaries, while the people who only value what you provide will disappear when you stop providing it. The sorting process is sometimes painful, but it's also clarifying in ways that make authentic relationships possible for the first time. Maria and I have planned a trip to visit her daughter in Puerto Rico next winter, my first international travel in over 20 years. The prospect fills me with excitement rather than anxiety because I know I'll be traveling with someone who values my companionship for its own sake rather than for what I might contribute to making her vacation more affordable or convenient. We are learning to be friends in the deepest sense of the word, people who choose each other's company, who support each other's dreams, who offer comfort without keeping score of who owes what to whom. My painting has progressed to the point where Rose, my instructor, has suggested I consider selling some of my work at local art fairs. The idea feels both thrilling and terrifying because it would mean putting my creativity into the world for judgment and evaluation, risks I haven't taken since I was young and still believed that my dreams mattered as much as everyone else's. But I'm thinking seriously about it because I've learned that the risks of staying safe and invisible are ultimately greater than the risks of being seen and possibly rejected. The financial damage David and Jennifer caused will take years to fully recover from, but my attorney has been successful in recovering about half of what they stole, and the legal protections we put in place have prevented any additional unauthorized access to my accounts. More importantly, I've learned to live on less money but with more happiness, to find richness in experiences rather than possessions, to measure wealth in terms of autonomy and authentic relationships rather than bank balances and family obligation. Every morning now, I wake up with a sense of possibility that was absent from my life for years. I make coffee because I enjoy the ritual, not because I'm hoping someone will call and share it with me. I plan my days around activities that bring me joy or satisfaction or growth, not around other people's crises or demands or expectations. I go to bed at night feeling tired from my own choices rather than exhausted by other people's drama. The woman in my mirror has continued to evolve, becoming someone I not only recognize but actually like and respect. Her hair is still silver, her face still lined with evidence of 7 decades of living, but her eyes are clearer now, more confident, less apologetic for taking up space in the world. She wears colors that make her feel alive, speaks words that reflect her thoughts rather than what she thinks other people want to hear, makes decisions based on her own values rather than other people's expectations. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't always easy or comfortable. There were moments when I questioned whether I was being too harsh, too selfish, too unforgiving. There were nights when the silence in my apartment felt overwhelming rather than peaceful, when I wondered if isolation was really preferable to exploitation. There were times when I missed the chaos of other people's problems because solving them had given my life a sense of purpose and meaning, even if that purpose was ultimately destructive to my own well-being. But gradually, I learned to fill the space that other people's drama had occupied with pursuits and relationships that fed my soul instead of draining it. I learned that saying no to the wrong requests creates room for saying yes to the right opportunities. I learned that self-respect is not selfish but essential, that boundaries are not walls but filters that allow love to flow while blocking manipulation and exploitation. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to choose yourself, never too late to demand respect, never too late to walk away from people who consistently treat you badly regardless of how much DNA you share with them or how much history you've accumulated together. Age brings wisdom, but it also brings the urgency of limited time, the recognition that every day spent accepting disrespect is a day not spent experiencing the joy and peace that come with authentic relationships and self-acceptance. The seasons have turned twice since that devastating morning when I discovered my empty bank account and realized that the people I loved most had been systematically stealing from me while I worried about having enough money to buy them Christmas gifts. 2 full cycles of spring awakening and summer abundance and autumn letting go and winter rest, each season teaching me different lessons about renewal and growth and the necessity of dormant periods that prepare us for new life. During my second summer of independence, I joined a community garden that had opened in a vacant lot 3 blocks from my apartment. The coordinator was a Dominican woman named Carmen who had convinced the city to lease the space to local residents who wanted to grow vegetables and flowers in the heart of Queens. The application process required a small fee and a commitment to tend my assigned plot regularly, responsibilities that would have felt overwhelming during my years of family crisis management but now felt like privileges I was eager to embrace. My plot was 8 feet by 10 feet of soil that had been neglected for years but still held the potential for growth under the right conditions. Carmen taught me how to test the soil's pH, how to add compost to improve its texture and nutrients, how to plan for succession planting that would provide fresh vegetables from early spring through late fall. The physical work of digging and weeding and watering was hard on my aging joints, but the mental satisfaction of nurturing something from seed to harvest was more rewarding than anything I had experienced in decades. I grew tomatoes that burst with flavor in ways that made grocery store tomatoes seem like pale imitations. I grew herbs, basil and oregano and cilantro, that perfumed my small kitchen and reminded me that I was capable of creating abundance rather than just managing scarcity. I grew beans that climbed wooden stakes Maria helped me install, producing enough vegetables to share with neighbors and still have plenty for myself. The act of harvesting food I had grown with my own hands felt like reclaiming some essential part of myself that had been buried under years of financial stress and family obligation. The garden became a place where I met people who shared my interests in nurturing and growth, but who didn't see me as a resource to be exploited. Mrs. Chen from the next plot over taught me how to grow bok choy and showed me photographs of similar gardens she had tended in Taiwan before immigrating to New York 30 years ago. Roberto, a construction worker who gardened early in the mornings before his shifts, helped me build raised beds that were easier on my back and shared vegetables from his plot when my own crops were struggling. These relationships were built around shared activity and mutual interest rather than need and obligation. We helped each other because we wanted to, not because we were guilt or manipulated into it. We shared resources because we had abundance to share, not because someone was demanding we solve their crisis at the expense of our own well-being. The difference between these garden friendships and my previous family relationships was so stark it sometimes took my breath away with its simple authenticity. The community garden also introduced me to seasons and cycles in ways that my apartment living had insulated me from for decades. I learned to pay attention to day length and temperature changes, to notice which plants thrived in spring's cool weather and which needed summer's heat to flourish. I learned that some crops, like lettuce and spinach, actually preferred the shorter days of fall and would bolt if planted during the long, hot days of July. The garden taught me patience with natural timing and acceptance of cycles beyond my control, lessons that carried over into my personal life in unexpected ways. When my tomato plants were devastated by late blight during a particularly humid August, I didn't see it as personal failure or evidence that I wasn't worthy of success. Instead, I composted the diseased plants, improved the soil with organic matter, and planned for better air circulation the following year. This acceptance of setbacks as learning opportunities rather than personal judgment felt revolutionary for someone who had spent decades blaming herself for other people's poor choices and emotional volatility. The garden also gave me a reason to interact with Emma in new ways when she started visiting regularly. She was fascinated by the process of growing food from seeds, by the invisible community of bacteria and worms that made healthy soil possible, by the way plants communicated through root systems and chemical signals. We spent hours together weeding and watering and harvesting, talking about everything and nothing while our hands stayed busy with purposeful work. "Grandma, why didn't you do this when I was little?" she asked one afternoon as we picked cherry tomatoes that had been warmed by late summer sun. Her question wasn't accusatory but genuinely curious, the kind of inquiry that comes from someone trying to understand how life unfolds over decades of choices and constraints. I considered her question while I filled my harvest basket, thinking about all the reasons I had never pursued activities that interested me during the years when my time and money and attention were completely consumed by other people's immediate needs. "I always thought I didn't have time for things like this," I said finally. There was always some crisis to solve, some emergency that seemed more urgent than planting seeds and waiting for them to grow. I forgot that some things can't be rushed, that some satisfaction comes from processes that take months or seasons to unfold. Emma nodded thoughtfully, her teenage brain processing the relationship between my past self-sacrifice and my current self-care. "Are you angry that you waited so long?" she asked. The question made me pause in my harvesting, cherry tomato halfway to the basket, as I searched for an honest answer that acknowledged regret without dwelling in bitterness. "Sometimes I am," I admitted. "But mostly I'm grateful that I discovered it at all. Some people never learn that they have the right to pursue their own interests. I'm lucky that I figured it out while I still have time to enjoy it." That conversation stayed with me through the fall harvest season, when the garden exploded with late-season abundance, winter squash and Brussels sprouts and kale that sweetened after the first frost. I preserved tomatoes and made pickles and froze beans, activities that connected me to generations of women who had fed their families from their own labor and planning. But unlike those women, I was preserving food for my own table, making choices based on my own preferences, creating abundance that belonged entirely to me. The shift from serving others to serving myself felt profound in ways I struggled to articulate even in my journal. For decades, every meal I cooked, every decision I made, every resource I allocated had been filtered through other people's needs and preferences. Now, for the first time since my childhood, I could choose what to grow, what to cook, what to eat based entirely on my own desires. The freedom felt intoxicating and sometimes overwhelming, like learning to use muscles that had been restrained for so long I had forgotten they existed. As autumn transformed the garden from green abundance to brown dormancy, I found myself reflecting on the parallels between plant cycles and human relationships. Some connections, like annual vegetables, produce intensely for a season and then die back, leaving only seeds for potential future growth. Others, like perennial flowers, sink deep roots and return year after year, becoming stronger and more established with time. The relationships that had drained me were like invasive weeds, fast-growing, resource-consuming, choking out the slower, more sustainable growth of genuine connection. My friendship with Maria had the qualities of a perennial, deep-rooted, steady, reliable, becoming more valuable with each passing season. Emma's visits felt like volunteer seedlings, surprising and delightful, growing in unexpected places but clearly belonging to the same garden. The community garden relationships were like succession plantings, offering different gifts at different times but all contributing to an overall sense of abundance and purposeful activity. Winter in the garden was a time of rest and planning, when the soil lay fallow but not empty, when microorganisms continued their invisible work of decomposition and regeneration. I used those months to study seed catalogs, to plan next year's plantings, to expand my knowledge of companion planting and organic pest control. The dormant season wasn't wasted time but essential preparation for future growth, another lesson that seemed to apply to my personal life in ways I was still discovering. During those quiet winter months, while the garden rested under snow and my morning walks took me past dormant plots that looked barren but held invisible potential, I found myself thinking more about Michael, my younger grandson, who had been almost silent during the family confrontations that ended my financial support. Unlike Emma, who had found the courage to reach out and rebuild our relationship on new terms, Michael seemed caught between his parents' narrative and his own intuitive understanding of right and wrong. He was only 12 during those difficult months, still young enough to be completely dependent on David and Jennifer for his understanding of family dynamics, still trusting enough to believe their version of events without questioning their motives or methods. I wondered sometimes if he missed our previous closeness, if he remembered the bedtime stories I used to read to him, the Saturday morning pancakes we made together, the way he used to run to me for comfort when his parents were fighting or stressed. But I also understood that preserving my own well-being meant accepting that not every relationship could be salvaged, that some connections might need to remain dormant for years before conditions were right for new growth. Michael was still living in a household where speaking positively about me was probably seen as betrayal, where maintaining loyalty to his parents required rejecting the grandmother who had once been one of his favorite people in the world. The loss of that relationship was one of the most painful aspects of choosing myself over family harmony, but I had learned through months of therapy and reflection that protecting Michael from his parents' manipulation might require temporary disconnection. Sometimes love means stepping back to avoid being used as a weapon in other people's battles, even when stepping back feels like abandonment to a child who doesn't understand the adult complexities that created the situation. Dr. Patricia Williams, the therapist I had started seeing during the most difficult months of family conflict, helped me understand that my feelings of guilt about Michael were normal but not necessarily rational. "You didn't create this situation," she reminded me during one of our weekly sessions. "You didn't choose to make family relationships conditional on financial support. You were forced to choose between enabling destructive behavior and protecting yourself from further exploitation. The fact that choice had consequences for innocent parties doesn't make it the wrong choice." Dr. Williams had worked with many elderly clients who struggled with family financial abuse, and she helped me understand that my experience was unfortunately common, that many aging people found themselves caught between their desire to help their adult children and their need to preserve their own financial security and emotional well-being. She taught me techniques for managing guilt and anxiety, helped me develop language for expressing my boundaries clearly and consistently, and supported my decision to prioritize my own healing over family reconciliation. Reconciliation can only happen when all parties are willing to acknowledge harm and commit to different behavior, she explained when I expressed hope that David and Jennifer might eventually apologize and attempt to rebuild our relationship on healthier terms. "Your willingness to forgive means nothing if the other parties aren't willing to change the behaviors that created the problem in the first place. Premature reconciliation often just creates opportunities for repeated harm." Her words helped me understand why I felt so peaceful about my decision to maintain distance from David and Jennifer even when mutual friends and neighbors suggested that I was being too harsh, that families should forgive and forget, that holding grudges wasn't good for anyone involved. I wasn't holding grudges, I was protecting myself from people who had demonstrated repeatedly that they valued my resources more than my well-being and who had shown no remorse for the harm their behavior had caused. The therapy also helped me process the complex emotions around my relationship with my late husband, Robert, and how his early death had shaped my approach to family relationships for the decades that followed. Robert had been a good man, a loving father, a partner who supported my dreams and treated me with consistent respect and affection. When he died of a heart attack at 54, I had been devastated not just by grief but by the sudden responsibility of raising two teenagers alone, of managing finances and household decisions and discipline without a partner to share the load. In my determination to be both mother and father to David and Sarah, I had developed patterns of overgiving and overprotecting that continued long after they became adults capable of managing their own lives. My guilt about Robert's absence from their lives had manifested as a willingness to sacrifice my own needs to compensate for what they had lost, to be everything to them even when being everything meant being nothing to myself. Survivor guilt is real, Dr. Williams explained when I described the years of single parenting that had trained me to see my own needs as optional, my own dreams as selfish luxuries I couldn't afford while my children needed so much. But your husband's death doesn't obligate you to sacrifice your entire life to compensate for their loss. Good parents prepare their children for independence, not dependence. Loving parents teach their children to consider other people's needs, not to see other people as resources for meeting their own needs. The therapy helped me understand that my years of overgiving had actually harmed David by preventing him from developing the problem-solving skills and emotional resilience that healthy adults need to navigate life's inevitable challenges. Every time I had solved his problems with my money, I had robbed him of the opportunity to develop his own solutions. Every time I had rescued him from the consequences of his poor decisions, I had prevented him from learning to make better decisions. You thought you were protecting him from hardship, Dr. Williams observed. But hardship teaches important lessons. When we prevent people from experiencing appropriate consequences for their choices, we prevent them from learning to make better choices. Your love was real, but it was expressed in ways that ultimately weakened rather than strengthened the people you were trying to help. Understanding the psychology behind my behavior didn't eliminate the pain of lost relationships or the sadness of realizing how much time I had wasted trying to buy love from people who were capable of taking but not giving. But it did provide a framework for understanding why change had been necessary and why maintaining my new boundaries was an act of love for everyone involved, even if it didn't feel that way in the short term. As winter gave way to another spring, I prepared for my second season in the community garden with knowledge and confidence I hadn't possessed the year before. I knew which varieties grew best in my particular plot, which pests were likely to be problems and how to prevent them, which plants would provide continuous harvests through succession planting. The planning and preparation felt purposeful and hopeful in ways that reminded me why I loved being alive despite the complicated relationships and financial betrayals that had marked recent years. Emma helped me start seeds in small pots that lined my kitchen windowsill, marveling at the way tiny green shoots emerged from what looked like dust and dirt. "It's like magic," she said one Saturday morning as we watered trays of tomato and pepper seedlings that would be transplanted to the garden after the last frost. "You can't see anything happening, and then suddenly there's life where there wasn't life before." Her observation about invisible processes that create visible results felt like a metaphor for emotional healing and personal growth. For months after I ended my financial support and established boundaries with David and Jennifer, nothing seemed to change except my own slowly growing sense of peace and self-respect. The external drama continued, the accusations and manipulation continued, the attempts to guilt me back into compliance continued. But something had shifted deep in my emotional soil, something too small to see but powerful enough to eventually transform everything that grew from it. My self-respect had been like those tiny seeds, dormant for years under layers of obligation and guilt and fear, but still viable, still capable of growth given the right conditions. Establishing boundaries had been like preparing the soil, removing the weeds of manipulation that had choked out healthier growth. Regular therapy had been like consistent watering and fertilizing, providing the nutrients needed for sustainable change rather than quick fixes that wouldn't last. The visible results, peace, contentment, authentic friendships, creative pursuits, financial security, were the flowers and fruits that emerged from invisible underground work that had taken months to establish. People who had known me during my years of family crisis sometimes commented on how different I seemed, how much happier and more confident I appeared, but they couldn't see the root system of boundaries and self-respect that made the external changes possible. "You're like a completely different person," Maria observed one Tuesday morning as we shared pastries and coffee at our favorite Dominican bakery. "Not different in your personality, but different in how you carry yourself. You seem like someone who knows she belongs in the world instead of someone who's apologizing for taking up space." Her words made me realize how much I had changed since that devastating October morning when I discovered my empty bank account and realized that the people I loved most had been systematically stealing from me. The woman who had sat in her kitchen that morning, shaking as she read the eviction notice and checked her bank balance, had been someone who believed she deserved whatever treatment others chose to give her, someone who had confused love with usefulness, someone who had forgotten that respect is not optional in healthy relationships. The woman I had become was someone who understood her own worth, who knew the difference between helping and enabling, who could say no without guilt and yes without obligation. She was someone who chose her own activities based on her own interests, who formed relationships based on mutual enjoyment rather than financial dependence, who could look in the mirror and see someone worthy of care and kindness rather than someone who existed primarily to solve other people's problems. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, and it wasn't complete. I suspected it would continue for whatever years I had left, as I discovered new aspects of myself that had been buried under decades of self-sacrifice. But it was real and sustainable, rooted in a foundation of self-respect that no one could steal or manipulate or take away without my permission. As I prepare to end this story, years have passed since that morning walk that changed everything. I'm sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I once discovered the evidence of my family's betrayal, but everything feels different now. The morning light streams through clean windows onto a table set for one, with a cup of coffee made exactly the way I like it, with a newspaper I chose because I wanted to read it, in an apartment that belongs entirely to me and reflects entirely my own choices and preferences. My garden is in its third season now, more productive and beautiful than I ever imagined possible when Carmen first showed me that plot of neglected soil. I've learned to grow things I never thought I could manage: delicate herbs, climbing beans, winter vegetables that thrive in cold weather. I've learned that patience and consistent care can transform even the most damaged ground into something abundant and life-giving. Emma is 17 now, getting ready for college, making plans for a future that includes regular contact with a grandmother who loves her without conditions or expectations. She's learned from watching my journey that relationships should energize rather than drain, that boundaries are expressions of self-love rather than selfishness, that it's possible to be alone without being lonely if you've learned to enjoy your own company. Michael has started calling occasionally, brief, tentative conversations that suggest he's beginning to form his own opinions about family dynamics as he matures and gains independence from his parents' influence. I don't push for more contact than he's comfortable with, but I let him know through Emma that my door is always open if and when he decides he wants a relationship with me that doesn't require him to choose sides in conflicts he didn't create. David and Jennifer continue their pattern of financial crisis and drama, but their emergencies no longer become my emergencies. I hear through neighborhood friends that they've had to downsize their housing, that Jennifer has returned to work, that David has learned to manage his business finances more carefully now that he can't rely on my resources to cover his mistakes. The changes haven't been easy for them, but they've been necessary for everyone involved. Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever reconcile in any meaningful way. I hope we will, but I no longer organize my life around that hope or sacrifice my peace of mind to make reconciliation more likely. I've learned that I can love my son from a distance, that I can hope for his happiness without enabling his irresponsibility, that I can forgive his betrayal without exposing myself to repeated harm. Maria and I took our trip to Puerto Rico last winter, spending 2 weeks with her daughter's family in a small town on the coast where the ocean stretches to the horizon and the pace of life moves with the rhythm of tides rather than the urgency of city schedules. It was my first real vacation in over a decade, the first time I had spent money on pure enjoyment without feeling guilty or anxious about resources that should be conserved for other people's emergencies. We swam in warm water and ate fresh fish and learned to play dominoes with Maria's grandson and his friends. We walked on beaches at sunset and talked about our lives, our losses, our hopes for whatever time we had left. We laughed at ourselves for being 70-something women having adventures we'd never dared to dream about when we were younger and believed that women our age should be content with smaller pleasures and more limited horizons. The trip reminded me that life continues to offer possibilities even in its later chapters, that adventure and growth and joy don't end at retirement or widowhood or even family betrayal. Maria and I are already planning our next adventure, a trip to see the fall foliage in Vermont, a region I've wanted to visit since I was young but never had the time or money or permission from my family obligations to pursue. My painting has progressed enough that I've started selling small pieces at a monthly art fair in Flushing Meadows Park. The sales don't generate significant income, but the act of creating something beautiful and having other people appreciate it enough to purchase it feels like validation of aspects of myself that were dormant for decades. Rose, my painting instructor, says I have a natural eye for color and composition, that my work shows the kind of emotional depth that only comes from people who have lived through difficulty and found ways to transform pain into beauty. Every morning, I still take that same walk through the neighborhood, past Mr. Martinez's bodega on Northern Boulevard, past the playground where I once pushed my grandchildren on swings. But the walk feels different now, not an escape from difficult relationships but a celebration of the peaceful life I've created for myself. The morning air still carries the scent of pretzel vendors and the distant hum of traffic, but it also carries the promise of a day that belongs entirely to me, filled with activities I've chosen for my own enjoyment and people who value my company for its own sake. To you who have listened to this entire story, who have followed me from that devastating morning discovery through months and years of difficult change to this place of contentment and purpose-filled living, I want to leave you with the most important lesson I've learned: it is never too late to choose yourself. It is never too late to demand respect. It is never too late to walk away from people who drain your energy and exploit your generosity, even if those people share your DNA and your history and your most precious memories. Your life is happening now, in this moment, with these choices. You don't have to wait for other people to change before you can be happy. You don't have to solve everyone else's problems before you can pursue your own dreams. You don't have to continue accepting disrespect because you're afraid of being alone, because loneliness is temporary but self-betrayal damages your soul in ways that last forever. The people who truly love you will find ways to respect your boundaries. The people who only value what you can do for them will disappear when you stop doing it, and their departure will clear space in your life for relationships that actually deserve your time and energy and affection. If my story sounds familiar to you, if you recognize yourself in the woman who gave until she had nothing left to give, please know that change is possible at any age, in any circumstances, with any family history or cultural background. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but it will happen if you decide that you're worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth celebrating. You are worth fighting for. You are worth protecting. You are worth celebrating. Your needs matter as much as anyone else's needs. Your dreams are valid regardless of your age or circumstances. Your happiness is important even if other people disagree. Your life belongs to you, and you have both the right and the responsibility to live it in ways that honor your worth rather than sacrifice it to other people's convenience. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about an elderly woman you've never met who learned late in life that it's never too late to choose dignity over exploitation, self-respect over self-sacrifice, authentic relationships over manipulative ones. If this story helped you in any way, if it gave you courage or clarity or hope for your own situation, please share it with others who might need to hear it. We're all walking each other home in this life, and sometimes the most loving thing we can do is tell our stories honestly, revealing both our mistakes and our victories so that others can learn from our experiences without having to repeat all our painful lessons. Your story matters too, whatever it is, wherever you are in the process of learning to value yourself and demand respect from others. May you find the courage to choose yourself. May you discover relationships that energize rather than drain you. May you learn the difference between loving someone and enabling them. And may you remember, always, that you are worthy of love, respect, kindness, and joy, regardless of what anyone else believes or how they choose to treat you. Your life is not over. Your story is not finished. Your best chapters may still be waiting to be written, in your own handwriting, according to your own values, surrounded by people who celebrate your worth rather than exploit it. That story starts the moment you decide you're worth fighting for. That story starts now.